Welcome to the Tom Woods Show, episode 424. We're talking about China today and Austrian economics there and what's going on economically there with Jing Jin, who comes to us all the way from Beijing, joining us via Skype. It's a miracle that we're able to do this. It really, really is. Jing Jin is Associate Dean at the China Economics and Management Academy in Beijing. She worked at the World Bank Research Group in Washington, D.C. as a consultant for 2.5 years. Then she returned to Asia in 2004 and worked in Lehman Brothers, J.P. Morgan, and elsewhere. She worked in the banking industry in Hong Kong until late last year. She earned her undergraduate degree in China, where she majored in economics, and also earned her Master's of Public Policy at Georgetown University. She also received a Ph.D. in East Asian Studies and International Economics from Johns Hopkins University. And as you'll hear, she was a fairly conventional economist until the financial crisis of 2008, and then she became more familiar with the Austrian school, and is more or less a convert now. So very, very interesting story, and I'm sure you'll understand why I want to talk to Jing Jin. All the way from Beijing, Jing Jin, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm looking to ask you questions about the Austrian school in China, but also about the situation in China overall in terms of both economics and politics, because we have quite a bit of controversy in the United States over this, and particularly even among Austrians. When they go to analyze what's going on in China, we get two what seem to me to be diametrically opposed analyses. We get, on the one hand, we're seeing really authentic, robust growth in China, and on the other hand, we get the whole thing as a giant credit bubble waiting to burst. Now, it could be a little of both. You could have some genuine growth and some artificial credit expansion, but we'll get into that a little bit later. I want to find out how somebody with your background, which I just shared with the audience, comes to have an interest in the Austrian school such that you gave an interview to the Mises Institute, which I will link to at tomwoods.com/424, in which you mentioned not only the name Mises, but the names Rothbard and Hoppe. How does that happen?
I came across with the term of Austrian economics while I worked at the investment bank. That was right after the financial crisis. And we thought Austrian school framework really explains what happened in 2008, the financial crisis. And also quite a number of arguments or the theories in Austrian economics explains all the confusions about what's going on in China, really, because we monitor these informations as part of our work all the time. So then later we went to a trip in New York and we found Mises' book in the store, and we came back, read through, then we realized, hey, this is something really explains what's going on, and this is really the economics we should have learned a long time ago.
How long had you at that point been a professional economist?
Well, I studied in the U.S. in Georgetown and Johns Hopkins. I came back to Asia in 2004. At the time, actually, I was looking for an economist job, but turned out to be sucked into the industry and started with DCM work. But then I have started this school where I am now the associate dean at the same time. So 10 years plus.
So, in other words, you came to adopt a school of thought that runs, well, somewhat counter to the training you received in the United States.
Oh, definitely. The interesting thing is when in 2003, when I was interviewed for an economist job in Hong Kong, one of the economists in the investment bank even asked me about Austrian school. At the time, I didn't even know what that was. It didn't really register with me then, but at the end of 2013, when I went to New York for a business trip, then we found a book by Mises. Then was the time I was really shocked at the fact that in Asia, in China in particular, we always think that U.S. is the most free liberated education system. And at the time when I realized that for the 7 years I studied in the U.S. and later through my discussions with so many economists trained in the Ivy League schools of economics department there, not a single one ever mentioned the name Mises or Rothbard to me, and how ignorant we have been to this school of thought. I felt at the time really, it's a feeling of betrayal almost.
Yeah, that is an interesting way of putting it. I certainly felt that way myself, and I know a great many other people have felt that way. And yet, as you're describing this process to me, what stands out is that, first of all, you were in the U.S. learning economics that runs counter to at least the official doctrine of the Chinese government, even though I know that at the Communist Party, whatever their major event is, a couple of years ago, they did say that markets ought to play a decisive role in the economy, which is interesting. But the fact that you were able to come to the West and learn economics that more or less they knew would, at least in some way or another, even though it wasn't Austrian, would nevertheless challenge the regime, and that you can sit here and talk to me about economics that challenges the regime, and you can teach that economics at your school, says to me that there is something different about this regime than it was 2 generations ago. So what exactly happened, and when did it happen?
Well, I would say this is a very complicated process, and I don't know how to make it in a very clear manner. But just I can just share with you how I really feel about all this. When we say Communist Party or communism, when it was introduced into China, of course, if you follow a very strict framework, then you basically already know what it is, even in terms of economic structure. But the truth, when in the early 20th century, when communism was introduced in China, it was a time when China was invaded by, we call it imperialist forces, and also a place where basically in ruins after 300 years of the Manchurian rules. So it's more for its nationalistic nation-building efforts. So they just grabbed something from the West and thought, okay, everything's in the West. If they can lead them to the industrialization and wealth, then it certainly can do the same in China. So the way Chinese understand communism is not exactly the same as where you come from, and then you understand almost even the religious roots of where that come from. But to the Chinese, they just grab something that is convenient, and there's a party and they need to use it for the nationalistic drive and the nation building after thousands of years of imperial court rules. That's how it was started. Actually, Marxism was introduced into China at the same time with anarchism in the early 20th century. So it's really in a sense, I'm not sure a lot of people would agree with me, but I did think about this for some time. It's really for their practical purposes, and they used this. So if you think China as a empire for thousands of years, its economy has always been very decentralized in a way. Because in an agrarian society, there's simply no way to be able to have a very highly centralized system, given this vast land and the geography and the ethnic combinations. So that's how it starts. So China has never been as centralized as, say, for example, the former Soviet Union. Then, yeah, this is the historical part that I think it's always worthwhile to trace back to. But yes, most people would started from the 1978 when the economic reform started. Then again, the party has never said we're going to abandon the party's doctrine, but they say, okay, we will have an open door policy, we'll liberate the economy and let people release their productivity. So, yeah, I think it has its historical logic on top of what they think where this economic reform is supposed to go.
What is your impression of how the average person in China looks back on the period of Chairman Mao? In the West, we have people who say Chairman Mao was one of the greatest mass murderers of all time, but on the other hand, we have some so-called progressives on the left who argue that, to the contrary, he was a great modernizer, and the deaths attributed to him are attributed to him unfairly because they're the result of famine, which is beyond his control. Is there a general consensus today about his legacy?
No, there isn't. People are always polarized about on the issue about his contributions and his role in China's modern history. In my view, what you said are both true. So he's a very complicated figure, and then he did contributed a lot in terms of China's nation building as a national state after China being ruled, as I said, for 300 years by Manchurian. But he also did a lot of crazy things, anti-human nature things. That I don't have a right word for it, but it's really devastating. Almost every Chinese family suffered from it.
There's so many things I want to ask you. I want to talk about this further, but at the same time, I do want to talk about the economy and Austrian economics and so forth. But I also want to ask you about censorship of the internet in China. Is there any, and to what extent does it exist?
Yes, Google was banned in China, YouTube, which is terribly inconvenient for me because I use YouTube a lot when I'm in Hong Kong. Yeah, the censorship is pretty severe, I would say. But it's, I don't know if when people are talking about the censorship, it's not like what happened in the several decades ago. Basically, people in a small group, you still basically can discuss a lot of things pretty freely, even political jokes all over WeChat. So I would say Chinese people has a lot of freedom in terms of speech, freedom of speech. But the censorship does exist, which we dislike a lot because we use Google Scholar all the time writing papers, and without it, it's terribly inconvenient. I still don't understand why they do that, because given Chinese economy today and the state and the people's lifestyle, they shouldn't be this insecure as to ban all these things, which is a surprise to me. But I have to be fair, it's not exactly like a lot of people said. There's basically nothing you can read and see. For example, Mises.org, you can access it very easily. And I don't mind buying CNN.
Yeah. So that's interesting that ideas can spread, but they don't want YouTube in general. Even the whole world is using YouTube. And I can understand why you would, if you had a government like this, you would want to restrict this sort of content. You don't want these ideas spreading, and you don't want testimonies from China going out, perhaps, in some cases. But as you say, since the free flow of ideas seems to be taking place in so many other areas, it's a bit of a puzzle. I guess I want to ask you the million-dollar question from the American point of view, and that is, what is your assessment of the current economic picture in China? Because here we get two different pictures. We get one picture showing tremendous growth in which people take the figures given by the Chinese regime at face value and say they're having tremendous economic growth. On the other hand, we have people who say it's not real growth, and we see these pictures of these ghost towns with all this building, these huge buildings that are unoccupied, where there's no economic activity, where there appears to be no human activity, and this appears to be a classic case of an Austrian business cycle going on. So what is your view of what the future holds for China and what the real story is of the Chinese growth that we're seeing? Is it real?
Oh, definitely it is real. I mean, yeah, talking about the quality of Chinese statistics, we can talk for hours. And also I see debates about all this. Ultimately, if you look at the grassroots data, they actually come up and supporting the adjusted GDP growth rate. So on that front, I don't really question a lot about the number per se. From my own observation, I do think China has a very sound economic fundamentals. I guess when people talk about Chinese economists, they usually assume there are already a lot of hypotheses in their mind. So from that, and they take a number here and there, and they put into that picture, which is pretty much an economic structure of the U.S. rather than that of the China's. And then they come up with a conclusion, says, hey, this is a ghost town. It's like in Shanghai and Beijing, I don't see that. And we do see that the housing prices is flattening, which is fine, because if you consider people worrying about ghost town because they thought when the bubble burst and then the economy would collapse. But there are two factors that China are so different from that in the U.S. One is considering the Chinese people, not until the 1990s that they started being able to own their own apartments and property. That's only 20 years ago. And then people, given how much Chinese people love to save, of course, that's at the time when there's no financial tools on which they can invest it, and housing has become their only saving tools. So a lot of people put their money into purchasing apartments, which is quite understandable. But also, if you look at today's housing prices on a nationwide basis, on a per capita GDP or personal income basis adjusted, the housing prices has been coming down in the past 15 years. So how could you say this is a bubble? And also, if you look at the leverage of Chinese households, Chinese love to save. I think I hope that there's no dispute about that. Even for the bank requirements of mortgages, basically, if you added all the rules together, the minimum down payment is actually 50%. So the leverage we're talking about in China is completely a different picture from that in the US. So everything put together, I don't see why housing is a bubble. There are ghost cities, mostly in the third tier or fourth tier cities there are, but like there was a ghost city which they used to have a coal mining booming, which is a typical case of malinvestment. And together with that is their property bubbles. But on a national level, we don't see that. We don't see a bubble at all.
What can you say about the question of slave labor that gets raised in Western circles quite a bit, particularly among labor unions and labor interests in the U.S.? They say that we have to cut back on our trade with China because it's unfair, because our American laborers can't be expected to compete against Chinese slave labor. And they throw this term around quite a bit. What can you say about the extent of so-called slave labor? What do you think they have in mind?
Okay, this is something new to me. So when they say slave labor, they're talking about the Chinese workers are terribly underpaid, or they're talking about like
to be honest with you, I don't even know exactly what the claim is. I think they may be of the belief that the regime can simply exploit people and put them in extremely undesirable conditions against their will in one way or another. I mean, not just against their will in the sense that it's lower pay than they might like, but they can actually force people into hard labor, political prisoners or whatever. I think that's the view that some Westerners have.
Well, I think cases like that happens in all countries, not only in China. I don't rule out the injustice done to some cases, an injustice done to a lot of people, but I don't see this as a nationwide phenomenon. Definitely not. Or in a lot of, if they're talking about coal mining workers who didn't have the proper protections, I think in many cases they voluntarily want to work in those mining in order to have a better paid job to bring back to their rural home. Okay, I'm no expert on that. I don't want to get things more complicated on it. But I don't see it as a national phenomenon, to put it simple. It's and also for a lot of labor-intensive assembly lines, people's working conditions are very good. I talked with an entrepreneur just recently, and he told me a lot of people still think that Chinese workers in Shenzhen, in the south part of China, they're still working with horrible conditions. He said that's totally wrong. They work in super good conditions with robots working with them, and they control computers, and that's where the productivity comes from. If you look at the savings rate for the past 37 years, ranges from 25% to 35%, and the capital deepening could happen in a very dramatic way.
I'm looking at an article right now that claims China's communist dictators operate more than 1,000 slave labor camps, and this accounts for between 3 to 5 million convicts, real criminals along with thought criminals guilty of opposing communism, promoting freedom, or practicing religion. Although the process doesn't wait on conviction. Chinese law permits the police to hold anyone for 4 years before judicial proceedings. These camps are estimated to have held between 40 and 50 million prisoners since they opened in 1949. I think this is the reference.
Oh, okay. That labor camp system has been there for decades, but I think in 2013, after decades of discussion of abandoning this system, it really happened that they did 2 years ago, said this got to be abandoned. To be honest, those labor camps during Cultural Revolution, even my parents were forced to work there. China has went through so many movements until 1978, the economic reform, and people come back to their senses and thought, hey, we got to make our life right, forget about movements, forget about all these ideology arguments, and we just want to have a better life. So, yeah, there are labor camps, but it's not only China's phenomenon, or it's not only Chinese Communist Party's idea. It's every ruler has their way of doing things like that.
Well, I want to close by asking you about Austrian economics in China and the extent to which young people can come into contact with it. We say in the United States that it's enjoying a bit of a rebirth, but at the same time, we have to realize that the numbers are still quite small, but they're growing and they're very enthusiastic and they're much larger than we expected them to be even several years ago. Is the situation similar in China to what I've just described in the U.S.? That there is an interest in it, in other words, among some people, and there are texts available to read in Chinese for those people who are interested.
Definitely, and I think there's tremendous interest in Austrian economics. Even I can only speak from my own experiences. I just started to spend more time in Beijing since the end of last year, and the people I encountered, surprisingly, many of them have already read The Ethics of Liberty, to my great surprise. So It's in Chinese, and like Human Action, the Austrian Perspectives of Economic Thought, all of these are available in Chinese. There are a lot more. Even I know a group is translating Mr. Dr. Hopper's book as well. So interestingly, I also see a higher interest in Austrian economics among young people. So yes, the number is still small in terms of 1.3 billion population, but definitely, I think it's growing fast. Like I almost have this personal experience on a daily basis. It's like several weeks ago when I visited a small town famous for its royal kiln of producing porcelain for royal families. I met with a group of archaeologists there, and they asked me about the property rights of the land, which is still right now in the legal sense, it belongs to the nation, to the government. And then I just sent them the book Ethics of Liberty. I said, maybe you can find your answer there. And then they embraced it. I find it's to so many people, it's so intuitive.
Well, that's of course how so many of us feel, that it appears intuitive to us, and we say to ourselves, isn't it a shame that we haven't encountered this before, precisely because it's so intuitive, and it does indeed make so much sense. Well, I'm very grateful to you for joining us all the way from Beijing, and I really appreciate your perspective. I get a lot of, as I say, I've read a lot of different people commenting on China, but very few of them have visited, much less have lived there. So your testimony is very valuable to us, and I'm glad to hear that there are budding Austrians in China as well. That is certainly good news. Thanks again, Jing. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom.
All right, everybody, make sure and check out the show notes page for today, tomwoods.com/424, because there I'll be linking to an interview Jing did with the Mises Institute about the Austrian school over in China, and that's got some additional information I know you guys will enjoy. Also, I mentioned that I was going to be posting a free sample of the new course we have up at libertyclassroom.com, course number 13. I've got the free sample up on the show notes page for episode 420 when I talked to Jason Jewell, the person teaching that course. So if you go to tomwoods.com/420, you'll get a tantalizing look at that fantastic new course on the history of conservatism and libertarianism. So tomwoods.com/420 is the link for that. And of course, if you scroll down on that or any other show notes page, you'll see a simple way to get my free ebook, 14 Hard Questions for Libertarians Answered. So the show notes pages are the place for you. Today's, again, is tomwoods.com/424. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.
The Tom Woods Show.